Blood dripped onto my white tablecloth, the one I'd spent 3 days ironing to perfection. As my son stood over me, his fist still clenched, his face twisted with a rage I'd never seen before. Christmas dinner was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it became the night I watched my family's true nature explode in the most horrifying way possible. But that lawyer sitting at my table? He was about to change everything. My name is Joanne Wells, and I'm 64 years old. I've lived in Fresno, California, for the past 40 years, in the same modest 3-bedroom house where I raised my 2 children after my husband died of a heart attack when I was just 35. I worked double shifts at the textile factory for 23 years, sacrificing everything, my health, my social life, even my dreams, to ensure Matthew and his sister never went without. I paid $47,000 out of pocket for Matthew's college education when he didn't qualify for enough financial aid. I gave him $15,000 as a down payment for his first car. When he married Kayla 5 years ago, I spent $12,000 helping them with wedding expenses they couldn't afford. This Christmas was supposed to be special. I'd invited my son, his wife Kayla, my daughter Rebecca, who was visiting from Portland, and Thomas Morrison, my lawyer and old friend who'd been helping me update my estate planning. I'd spent 2 full days preparing: a honey-glazed ham, garlic mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, freshly baked rolls, and my famous pecan pie. The house sparkled with decorations I'd put up myself, despite my arthritis making every movement painful. Matthew and Kayla arrived late, as usual, barely acknowledging my embrace. Kayla's eyes immediately scanned the living room, and I caught her whispering to Matthew, "Still the same cheap furniture." My heart sank, but I forced a smile. Rebecca helped me bring the food to the table, while Thomas, seated at the far end, made polite conversation about the beautiful Christmas tree. That's when it happened. Matthew grabbed his fork, stabbed into the mashed potatoes, and his face contorted. "This is lukewarm," he said coldly. "Mom, did you even try?" "Sweetheart, I brought everything out as soon as you arrived," I stammered. "You were 40 minutes late, so it's my fault?" His voice rose sharply. "You had one job today. One. Make a decent meal." Kayla smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Honestly, Matthew, did you expect anything different? She's been slipping for years." My hands trembled as I reached for his plate. "Let me warm it up for you, honey. It'll just take a minute." "Don't touch it!" Matthew roared, standing so abruptly his chair crashed backward. "You're pathetic. You can't even manage a simple Christmas dinner. You're not even good for cooking, you useless old woman." Before I could process his words, before I could even breathe, his fist came flying toward my face. The impact was thunderous. I heard the crack of my nose breaking, felt the explosion of pain radiating through my skull, tasted blood flooding my mouth. I crumpled to the floor, my vision swimming with stars. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard Kayla's laughter, sharp, delighted, cruel. "Oh my God, Matthew, maybe now she'll finally learn some respect," Rebecca screamed, rushing toward me, but I could barely see her through the blood streaming down my face. My beautiful tablecloth was ruined, red splatters mixing with the fallen mashed potatoes. The room spun violently, and then I heard it, the slow, deliberate scrape of a chair being pushed back. Thomas Morrison stood up, his face grave, his phone already in his hand. "Matthew Wells," Thomas said in a voice like steel, "I am an attorney, and I have just witnessed you commit felony assault and battery against your elderly mother. This dinner is over." Matthew's face went white. If you're as shocked as I was by what happened next, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. I need your support to tell the rest of this story. Also, comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment, and your words mean the world to me. The silence that followed Thomas's words was deafening. Matthew stood frozen, his hand still raised slightly, as if the reality of what he'd done was only now sinking in. Kayla's laughter died in her throat, her eyes darting between Thomas and her husband with growing panic. You can't," Matthew sputtered, his bravado crumbling. "This is a family matter. You have no right—" "I have every right," Thomas interrupted, his voice calm but lethal. "I'm a mandated reporter, and what I just witnessed constitutes elder abuse under California law, Penal Code 368, and as a citizen, I have a moral and legal obligation to report this crime." Rebecca was on her knees beside me, her hands shaking as she pressed a napkin to my bleeding nose. "Mom, "Oh God, Mom, can you hear me?" Tears streamed down her face as she cradled my head. I nodded weakly, the pain making it difficult to focus. My entire face throbbed, and I could feel my nose swelling rapidly. Blood soaked through the napkin, warm and sticky. Thomas had his phone to his ear. "Yes, 911, I need to report an assault. An elderly woman has been attacked by her son at 1847 Cedar Avenue in Fresno. She's bleeding heavily from a facial injury. Yes, the attacker is still on the premises." Wait! Matthew's voice rose to a panicked shout. He lurched toward Thomas, hands outstretched. "You can't call the cops. It was an accident. I didn't mean—" "Step back, Mr. Wells," Thomas commanded, his free hand raised in warning. "Do not approach me. Do not touch your mother again. The police are already on their way." Kayla jumped to her feet, her face flushed with anger and fear. "This is ridiculous. Matthew barely touched her. She's clearly exaggerating. Look at her, playing the victim like always." "Playing the victim?" Rebecca's voice was pure fury as she whirled on Kayla. "Her nose is broken. There's blood everywhere. What is wrong with you people?" "She provoked him," Kayla shrieked. "Always guilt-tripping him, always making him feel like he owes her something. Maybe if she wasn't such a manipulative—" "Enough." Thomas's single word cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mrs. Kayla Wells, I strongly suggest you stop talking. Everything you say right now can and will be used as evidence of consciousness of guilt and spousal conspiracy." Kayla's mouth snapped shut, but her eyes blazed with hatred, directed at me. Matthew began pacing frantically, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane. Mom, tell him it was an accident. Tell him you don't want to press charges. Mom, please." I looked up at my son through the haze of pain and blood, and for the first time in my life, I truly saw him. Not the little boy I'd rocked to sleep, not the teenager I'd defended when he got in trouble at school, not the young man whose dreams I'd financed with my own sacrifice. I saw a stranger, a cruel, entitled stranger who had just shattered more than my nose. He'd shattered every illusion I'd held about who he was. "No," I whispered, my voice thick and distorted from the injury. "No, Matthew." His face contorted in disbelief. "What?" "I won't tell him anything," I said more clearly, despite the pain. "You broke my nose. You called me useless, and you didn't even hesitate." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Matthew's panic transformed into something uglier, rage mixed with desperation. "You're going to regret this, old woman," he hissed, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You have no idea what you're starting. That house? That savings account? I know you've been planning to leave everything to me. You think I don't know? Well, good luck finding anyone to take care of you when you're rotting in some nursing home. We're done. You hear me? Done." Kayla grabbed her purse, her voice dripping with venom. "We should have cut you off years ago, you pathetic leech. All you do is take. Our time, our energy, our holidays. Well, congratulations, Joanne. You just lost your only son who actually gave a damn about you." The sirens stopped right outside my house. Red and blue lights flashed through my windows, painting my ruined Christmas dinner in surreal, pulsating colors. Thomas opened the front door just as 2 police officers approached. "Officers," he said calmly, "thank you for responding so quickly. The victim is here, and the assailant hasn't left the premises." The police officers, a stern-looking woman named Officer Martinez and her partner, Officer Chen, entered my home with practiced efficiency. Officer Martinez immediately knelt beside me, her eyes assessing my injuries with professional concern. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name?" she asked gently. "Joanne Wells," I managed, my voice nasal and thick from the blood. "This is my home." Officer Chen had positioned himself between Matthew and the rest of us, his hand resting on his belt in a subtle but clear warning. "Sir, I need you to remain calm and stay exactly where you are." Matthew's face had gone from white to flushed red. "Officer, this is all a huge misunderstanding. My mother and I had a disagreement. Things got heated, but—" "Mr. Wells," Thomas interrupted, stepping forward with his business card extended. "I'm Thomas Morrison, attorney at law. I witnessed the entire assault." Mr. Wells struck his mother with a closed fist directly in the face with sufficient force to break her nose. Prior to the assault, he verbally berated her, calling her useless and not even good for cooking. His wife, Mrs. Kayla Wells, laughed at the victim's injuries immediately after the assault occurred. Officer Martinez's expression hardened as she looked at Matthew. "Is this true, sir? I barely touched her." Matthew's voice cracked. "She's old. Her bones are fragile. It was a reflex. The food was cold, I was frustrated, and I—" "So you admit you struck her?" Officer Chen asked, pulling out his notepad. Matthew's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Kayla grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. "Don't say another word, Matthew. We need a lawyer." "Wise advice," Thomas said dryly. "Though perhaps you should have thought of that before committing assault and battery in front of a witness." Rebecca had gotten ice from the freezer and was gently holding it against my face. The paramedics arrived moments later, a young man and woman who immediately began assessing my injuries. The woman, whose name tag read Sandra, spoke to me in soothing tones as she examined my nose. "Mrs. Wells, this is definitely broken. We need to transport you to the hospital for treatment. You'll likely need surgery to set it properly." Surgery. Another expense I couldn't afford. My insurance had a $3,000 deductible I hadn't met this year. But looking at Matthew's face, still defiant, still angry, showing no remorse, I realized that money was the least of my concerns. Officer Martinez approached Matthew with handcuffs. "Matthew Wells, you're under arrest for assault and battery against an elder, which is a violation of California Penal Code 243E1 and 368. You have the right to remain silent." "This is bullshit!" Matthew exploded, trying to jerk away. Officer Chen immediately stepped in, helping his partner secure Matthew's wrists. "You're arresting me? On Christmas? For disciplining my own mother?" "Disciplining?" Rebecca's voice was shrill with outrage. "You punched her! She's bleeding! She's 64 years old!" Kayla's face twisted with contempt. "Oh, please. She's been manipulating Matthew for years. Guilt trips, passive-aggressive comments, always playing the martyr. She probably faked how bad it is just to get attention." Officer Martinez turned to Kayla with cold eyes. "Ma'am, are you saying your husband did strike Mrs. Wells?" Kayla's face paled as she realized her mistake. No, I mean, it wasn't that hard, and she—" "Kayla, shut up!" Matthew roared as the officers began leading him toward the door. Thomas stepped forward again. "Officers, I should mention that Mrs." Kayla Wells laughed immediately after the assault. I believe her exact words were, "Oh my God, Matthew. Maybe now she'll finally learn some respect." This was said while Mrs. Wells was on the floor, bleeding. "I'd be happy to provide a written statement." Officer Chen nodded grimly. "We'll need that statement, sir." "Ma'am," he addressed Kayla, "we may have additional questions for you. Don't leave the area." As the paramedics helped me onto the stretcher, I caught one last glimpse of my son being led out of my house in handcuffs. He turned his head toward me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't remorse or regret. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. "I'll make you pay for this," he shouted as the officers pushed him through the door. "You'll be sorry, you miserable old—" The door slammed shut, cutting off his words. Rebecca climbed into the ambulance with me, holding my hand tightly. Thomas followed in his own car, promising to meet us at the hospital. As we pulled away from my house, still decorated with Christmas lights that now seemed to mock the evening's horror, I began to cry. Not from pain, though my face was agony. I cried because I'd finally seen the truth about my son, and it had destroyed me. The emergency room at St. Agnes Medical Center was chaos incarnate. Crying children, elderly patients on gurneys, the overwhelming smell of antiseptic mixed with human suffering. But despite the crowd, the moment the intake nurse saw my swollen, blood-crusted face, I was fast-tracked through triage. "Elder abuse case," I heard the nurse murmur to her colleague, and shame washed over me like ice water. Elder abuse. Those words applied to me now. I was a statistic, a victim, a cautionary tale. At 64 years old, I'd been beaten by my own son in my own home on Christmas Day. Rebecca never left my side, her hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel her trembling. Thomas had arrived shortly after us and was in the hallway, speaking with police officers who'd come to take my official statement. Through the partially open curtain, I could hear fragments of their conversation. Documented history of verbal abuse, witness testimony, photographs of the scene. The doctor who examined me was a kind-faced woman in her 50s named Dr. Patel. She gently palpated my nose, took x-rays, and confirmed what the paramedics had suspected: a displaced nasal fracture requiring surgical intervention. Mrs. Wells, she said softly, pulling up a chair beside my bed, I need to ask you some difficult questions. This isn't the first time you've been injured, is it? My eyes widened. What do you mean? She pulled up images on her tablet, pointing to the x-rays. Your medical history shows 3 previous ER visits in the past 18 months. A fractured wrist you claimed was from a fall in October of last year, bruised ribs in March that you attributed to dropping a box on yourself, and a concussion in July that you said resulted from slipping in your bathroom. The memories flooded back. Each incident, each lie I'd told to protect Matthew. The wrist had been from him grabbing me too hard during an argument about money. The ribs from him shoving me into the kitchen counter when I'd criticized Kayla. The concussion from him pushing me backward when I'd suggested he was drinking too much. My voice failed me. Rebecca's gasp told me she hadn't known. Mom? Were those all? I couldn't look at her. The shame was suffocating. Matthew has been under a lot of stress. His job, the mortgage, Kayla's spending habits. He just loses his temper sometimes. It was never this bad before. Never this bad? Doctor. Patel's voice was gentle but firm. Mrs. Wells, you've sustained thousands of dollars in medical expenses from injuries inflicted by your son. This pattern indicates escalating violence. Today he broke your nose. Next time, it could be your skull. The words hit me like a physical blow. Next time. Would there have been a next time if Thomas hadn't been there? If I'd made excuses again, smoothed things over, begged Matthew to forgive me for provoking him? A social worker named Patricia joined us, a woman with compassionate eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She explained California's mandatory reporting laws, victims' rights, and the resources available to me. She mentioned restraining orders, victim compensation programs, and support groups for elder abuse survivors. The district attorney will likely file charges regardless of whether you cooperate, Patricia explained. Elder abuse is taken very seriously in California. With the witness testimony from Mr. Morrison and your documented injury pattern, they have a strong case. Thomas entered then, his expression grave. Joanne, the police want to take your statement, but before they do, there's something you need to know. He sat down, choosing his words carefully. When I was updating your estate planning last month, you mentioned that Matthew had been pressuring you to sign over the deed to your house. You said he wanted you to add him as a joint tenant so he could help manage your affairs as you got older. I nodded slowly, remembering the uncomfortable conversations. Matthew had brought it up at least a dozen times, insisting it was for my own good. Joanne, Thomas continued, your house is worth approximately $385,000 in the current market. If you had signed it over to Matthew as joint tenant with right of survivorship and then something happened to you, an accident, a fall, sudden death, he would inherit the property outright, bypassing probate. No questions asked. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Rebecca's face went ashen. You think he was planning to... I think, Thomas said carefully, that Matthew has been financially and physically abusing his mother for years, escalating in severity, while simultaneously positioning himself to inherit her primary asset. The pattern is concerning. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. But he's my son. He couldn't... The look Thomas gave me was filled with pity. Joanne, he said gently, tonight he broke your nose over lukewarm mashed potatoes. What do you think he might do for nearly $400,000? 3 days after Christmas, I sat in the office of Deputy District Attorney Marcus Richardson, my face still swollen and bruised, my nose held together by a splint and surgical tape. The rhinoplasty had cost me $2,800 out of pocket after insurance, money I'd been saving for a new water heater. But that seemed insignificant now compared to what I was learning. Marcus Richardson was a tall African-American man in his 40s with an intensity that was both intimidating and reassuring. He'd been prosecuting elder abuse cases for 15 years, and the file spread across his desk showed exactly how seriously he was taking Matthew's case. Mrs. Wells, he began, his voice professional but kind, I want to walk you through the charges we're filing against your son. First, assault and battery against an elder in violation of Penal Code 368B, 1. Because he caused great bodily injury, your broken nose, this is a felony charge carrying 2 to 4 years in state prison. I felt physically sick. Prison. My son in prison. Despite everything, the thought made my stomach churn. Additionally, Marcus continued. "We're charging him with elder abuse under Penal Code 368C, which is also a felony. The witness testimony from Mr. Morrison, combined with your medical history showing a pattern of abuse, makes this a particularly strong case." Thomas, sitting beside me, nodded grimly. He'd provided a detailed written statement, and the police had photographed the crime scene. My blood still splattered on the white tablecloth, the overturned chair, the food scattered across the floor. "What about Kayla?" Rebecca asked from her seat on my other side. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job in Portland to stay with me. She laughed while Mom was bleeding on the floor. "Doesn't that count for something?" Marcus's expression hardened. "We're exploring charges for Mrs. Kayla Wells as well. At minimum, she could face accessory after-the-fact charges for attempting to minimize and cover up the assault. However, her statements to the police, claiming your mother exaggerated the injury and provoked the attack, demonstrate consciousness of guilt and could potentially support a conspiracy charge. A part of me, the part that had spent 30 years being a mother first and a person second, wanted to stop this. Wanted to say it wasn't that bad, that Matthew deserved another chance, that families should forgive. But then, I touched the splint on my broken nose, remembered the sound of Kayla's laughter, recalled Matthew's words as he was arrested. "I'll make you pay for this." "There's more," Marcus said, sliding a document across his desk. "We've been investigating your son's finances, and we found some disturbing information. Matthew Wells filed for bankruptcy 18 months ago, listing debts of over $94,000, mostly credit card debt in both his and his wife's names." My breath caught. $94,000. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, "we found text message exchanges between Matthew and Kayla discussing your assets. These messages date back over 2 years. He handed me printouts that made my blood run cold. "Matthew, Mom's house has to be worth at least $350K. If we can get her to sign it over, we can take out a home equity loan. Kayla, she'll never agree. The old bat is too stubborn. Matthew, then we convince her she's losing her memory, can't manage her own affairs, make her dependent on us. Kayla, or we wait for her to die. How much longer can she really have? She's ancient." I was 64, not ancient, not dying. But to them, I was just an obstacle standing between them and my money. Rebecca snatched the papers from my hands, reading with mounting horror. "They were planning this for years. Mom, they were trying to steal everything from you." Thomas leaned forward, his lawyer's mind already working. "Marcus, this constitutes attempted financial elder abuse, doesn't it? Undue influence, exploitation." "Absolutely," Marcus confirmed. "We're adding charges of attempted financial elder abuse under Welfare and Institutions Code 15610. Thomas, if convicted on all counts, Matthew Wells is looking at 5 to 7 years in state prison, possibly more." I sat there, numb, as the full scope of my son's betrayal crystallized before me. This wasn't a momentary loss of control. This wasn't stress or frustration boiling over. This was calculated, premeditated abuse. Matthew and Kayla had been systematically working to isolate me, make me doubt myself, position themselves to take everything I'd worked for. The house I'd paid $127,000 for 40 years ago. The savings account with $43,000 I'd accumulated from decades of factory work. The small investment portfolio worth $38,000 that represented my entire retirement security. "Mrs. Wells?" Marcus's voice broke through my shock. "I need to know if you're willing to cooperate with this prosecution." I looked up at him, and for the first time in 3 days, I felt something other than pain and shame. I felt anger. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'll cooperate fully." I should have known Matthew wouldn't go down without a fight. 5 days after being released on $50,000 bail, posted by Kayla's mother, I later learned, Matthew hired a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but Gerald Hutchins, a criminal defense attorney known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to paint victims as villains. The first salvo came in the form of a cease and desist letter delivered to my home. Thomas read it aloud in my living room, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "My client, Matthew Wells, demands that Joanne Wells immediately cease all false and defamatory statements regarding the events of December 25th. The alleged assault was in fact a case of mutual combat in which Mrs. Wells initiated physical contact by attempting to strike Mr. I, Wells with a serving spoon, necessitating a defensive response. Furthermore, Mrs. Wells has a documented history of mental instability and has been experiencing memory loss and paranoid delusions, making her testimony unreliable. "That's insane!" Rebecca exploded. "Mom never touched him, and she doesn't have memory problems. He was planning to make her think she did." Thomas set the letter down, his jaw clenched. "This is a standard defense strategy. They're trying to establish an alternate narrative before trial. The mutual combat claim is absurd. There's no evidence of that. But the mental instability angle is more insidious. They're going to try to paint Joanne as confused, unreliable, perhaps even abusive toward Matthew." "How can they say that?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "I gave that boy everything, everything. And now he's calling me mentally unstable?" The next attack came through social media. Kayla had always been active online, but now she launched a full-scale campaign. She posted on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, painting herself and Matthew as victims of a vindictive, manipulative elderly mother who had finally shown her true colors. Her posts were masterful in their cruelty. "My heart is breaking. My husband is facing prison time because his elderly mother fell during an argument and blamed him for her injuries. We've tried for years to get her help for her declining mental state, but she refuses. Now she's destroying our family with lies. Please pray for us during this difficult time. False accusations. Elder care. Off family tragedy." The post had 347 likes and dozens of comments supporting her. People I'd never met were calling me a liar, a manipulator, an abuser. Some even suggested I should be investigated for fraud. Rebecca found me crying over the posts one evening. "Mom, don't read this garbage. These people don't know you. They don't know the truth." But the campaign was working. 2 of my neighbors, women I'd known for 20 years, stopped talking to me. I overheard one of them at the grocery store. "I always thought Joanne was so sweet, but you never really know people, do you? Her son seems like such a nice young man." Thomas filed immediate motions to have Kayla's posts removed, arguing they were attempts to taint the jury pool and intimidate a witness. But the damage was done. The narrative Matthew and Kayla were crafting, the ungrateful, lying mother versus the dutiful, falsely accused son, was spreading. Then came the truly devastating blow. Matthew filed a lawsuit against me. Not just any lawsuit, a civil suit seeking $150,000 in damages for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and malicious prosecution. The complaint alleged that I had knowingly and maliciously made false statements to police, resulting in my son's wrongful arrest and criminal prosecution, causing him severe emotional distress, reputational harm, and financial damages, including legal fees and lost wages. Thomas's face was grim as he read the complaint in my kitchen. "This is what's called a SLAP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's designed to intimidate you, drain your resources, and potentially force you to drop the criminal charges against him." "Can he do this?" I asked, my hands shaking. "Can he really sue me for reporting that he broke my nose?" "Legally, he can file anything he wants. Whether it will succeed is another matter. California has strong anti-SLAP laws precisely for situations like this. We can file a motion to strike, and if successful, Matthew will have to pay your attorney fees." "But in the meantime?" Rebecca asked. "In the meantime," Thomas said heavily, "this lawsuit will cost Joanne time, money, and tremendous stress, which is exactly what Matthew wants." I looked at the legal papers spread across my kitchen table. Criminal charges, civil complaints, cease and desist letters. My modest savings were dwindling. I'd already spent $2,800 on surgery, and now I'd need to pay Thomas for defending me against Matthew's lawsuit. The $43,000 I'd saved for retirement was evaporating like morning dew. But as I sat there, surrounded by the legal warfare my own son had launched against me, something inside me hardened. "Fight it," I said quietly. "Fight all of it. I don't care what it costs. Matthew chose this war, and I'm not going to surrender just because he's trying to bury me in paperwork and lies." Thomas smiled grimly. "Then we fight. And Joanne, we're going to win." The call came on a rainy Tuesday morning in early January, 2 weeks after Matthew's counterattack began. I didn't recognize the number and nearly let it go to voicemail before deciding to answer. "Mrs. Wells, my name is Diana Peterson. I was married to your son Matthew from 2009 to 2012. I need to talk to you. I dropped into a kitchen chair, my heart pounding. Matthew's first wife. He'd barely spoken about that marriage, dismissing it as a youthful mistake that had ended amicably. I'd met Diana only once, briefly, at their small courthouse wedding. She'd seemed sweet but nervous, and I'd always wondered what happened. I saw the news about Matthew's arrest, Diana continued, her voice shaking slightly. And I've been going back and forth about whether to reach out. But when I saw Kayla's social media posts calling you a liar, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Mrs. Wells, your son is dangerous, and I have proof. We met the next day at a coffee shop in downtown Fresno. Diana was 36 now, a pretty woman with auburn hair and tired eyes. She carried a thick folder that she placed on the table between us with trembling hands. I should have warned you years ago, she began, tears already forming. But I was ashamed. I thought if I just moved on and forgot about it, I could pretend that chapter of my life never happened. She opened the folder. Inside were police reports, hospital records, photographs that made my stomach turn. Diana's face bruised and swollen, her arm in a cast, a restraining order with Matthew's name on it. It started 6 months after we got married, she said quietly. Small things at first, pushing me, grabbing my arm too hard, punching walls near my head. Then it escalated. He broke my wrist, cracked 2 of my ribs, gave me a concussion so bad I couldn't work for 3 weeks. The parallels to my own experience were horrifying. Why didn't you tell anyone? I did. I told my parents, but Matthew convinced them I was exaggerating. He was so charming, so convincing. He'd cry and apologize, promise it would never happen again, buy me gifts. And I believed him, over and over, until the night he strangled me until I passed out. Diana's hand went to her throat unconsciously. That's when I finally left. I filed for divorce, got a restraining order, and moved to Sacramento. I paid him $18,000 just to make him go away, money from my grandmother's inheritance. It was worth every penny to be free of him. I stared at the documents, my vision blurring with tears. Did you tell the police about this? The district attorney? I called Marcus Richardson yesterday. I'm willing to testify about the pattern of abuse. In California, evidence of prior domestic violence is admissible to show propensity in elder abuse cases. These records could be crucial to your case, but Diana had brought more than just old police reports. She'd brought something even more damaging to Matthew's defense. After our divorce, I kept tabs on Matthew from a distance, just to make sure he wasn't coming after me. I noticed he married Kayla in 2020, and I felt sorry for her, until I realized she was just like him. Diana pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of text messages, emails, and social media posts she'd archived. Kayla knew exactly who Matthew was. She didn't just enable his behavior, she encouraged it. Look at this. The messages were between Kayla and a friend, dated from 2021. Kayla, Matthew's mom is such a pushover. She literally gives him whatever he wants if he yells loud enough. It's pathetic. Friend, doesn't that bother you? Kayla, are you kidding? It's perfect. She's loaded. House paid off, savings, investments. Matthew says when she dies, we'll inherit everything. I just have to put up with her guilt trips until then. More messages detailed their financial schemes, their contempt for me, and shockingly, references to Matthew's anger management issues that Kayla found kind of hot. Thomas nearly fell out of his chair when Diana presented all of this at his office the following day. This is incredible, he breathed, flipping through the documentation. This establishes a clear pattern of domestic violence, financial abuse, and premeditation. Diana, you're willing to testify to all of this? Every word, Diana said firmly. Matthew destroyed 3 years of my life. He's not going to get away with doing the same thing to his own mother. Marcus Richardson was equally stunned when we met with him. With this testimony and documentation, Matthew's defense strategy completely falls apart. They're claiming Joanne is mentally unstable and the assault was an accident. But this shows Matthew has a documented history of escalating violence against women in his life. For the first time since Christmas, I felt something that had been absent for weeks: hope. As Matthew's trial date approached in late February, the battle intensified on all fronts. Gerald Hutchins, Matthew's attorney, filed motion after motion attempting to suppress evidence, exclude Diana's testimony, and delay the proceedings. Each motion required a response from Marcus Richardson, and each hearing meant another day I had to face my son across a courtroom. The preliminary hearing was my first time seeing Matthew since his arrest. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But when his gaze met mine, there was no remorse, only cold, calculated hatred. Kayla sat directly behind him in the gallery, dressed conservatively in a way that seemed designed to project respectability. She glared at me with undisguised contempt. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to Thomas, presided over the preliminary hearing with stern efficiency. She was a woman in her early 60s who had a reputation for being tough on domestic violence and elder abuse cases. Hutchins rose for his opening statement, and I braced myself for what was coming. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "what we have here is a tragic misunderstanding compounded by the natural confusion and memory issues that affect individuals of advanced age. Mrs. Joanne Wells, while undoubtedly well-meaning, has demonstrated a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior. Medical records will show that she's had multiple falls and injuries over the past 18 months, evidence not of abuse, but of declining physical and mental capacity." Marcus objected immediately. "Your Honor, counsel is testifying rather than arguing, and he's mischaracterizing medical evidence that actually supports the prosecution's case." Judge Morrison sustained the objection, but Hutchins continued unfazed. On Christmas Day, a simple disagreement about food temperature escalated when Mrs. Wells, in a moment of frustration, struck at my client with a serving utensil. In defending himself, Mr. Wells made unfortunate contact with his mother's face. "It was an accident, Your Honor, not an assault." The lies were so smoothly delivered that I almost doubted my own memory. Almost. Then Marcus called Thomas Morrison to the stand. Thomas was an exceptional witness, calm, clear, and utterly credible. He detailed exactly what he'd seen: the verbal abuse, Matthew's explosive rage, the deliberate punch to my face, Kayla's laughter. Hutchins tried to shake his testimony during cross-examination, suggesting Thomas was biased because he was my friend and attorney. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you stand to profit from this prosecution? That you've been hired to represent Mrs. Wells in a financial capacity?" Thomas didn't blink. "I'm representing Mrs. Wells in updating her estate planning, which she initiated months before this incident. My witnessing of the assault was purely coincidental. I was invited to Christmas dinner as a family friend, not as her attorney, and I'm not being paid to testify. I'm here because I watched a man nearly twice his mother's size punch her in the face hard enough to break her nose, and I have a moral and legal obligation to tell the truth about what I saw." The courtroom was silent. Then Marcus called Diana Peterson. Diana's testimony was devastating. She walked the court through her marriage to Matthew, documenting the escalating abuse with medical records, police reports, and photographs that made several people in the gallery gasp. Hutchins tried to object, arguing that prior bad acts were inadmissible, but Judge Morrison ruled against him. "In California, evidence of prior domestic violence is specifically admissible in cases involving elder abuse under Evidence Code 1109, she stated. "The witness may continue." Diana described the night Matthew strangled her, the terror of waking up not knowing if he'd killed her, the years of therapy she'd needed to recover. Then Marcus entered the text messages into evidence, Kayla's messages showing foreknowledge of Matthew's anger management issues and their plans to inherit my assets. Hutchins' cross-examination of Diana was brutal. He attacked her credibility, suggested she was lying for attention, implied she was mentally unstable. "Isn't it true, Ms. Peterson, that you were hospitalized for depression after your divorce?" "Yes," Diana said steadily, "because your client abused me so severely that I developed PTSD. That's what happens to people who are strangled by someone they trusted." When the preliminary hearing concluded, Judge Morrison ruled that there was sufficient evidence to bind Matthew over for trial. All charges would proceed. As we left the courthouse, Hutchins cornered us in the hallway. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly to Marcus. "My client has a settlement offer. If Mrs. Wells agrees to drop all charges, Mr. Wells will agree not to pursue his civil suit against her, and both parties can move on with their lives." Marcus didn't even pause. "My client isn't interested in settling with the man who broke her nose. See you at trial, Gerald." But I knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. The trial began on March 15th in a courtroom packed with spectators, reporters, and elder abuse advocates who'd learned about the case through Diana's testimony. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 26 to 73, listened intently as Marcus Richardson delivered his opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about power and control. It's about a son who spent years systematically abusing his elderly mother, physically, emotionally, and financially, while positioning himself to inherit her life savings. And on Christmas Day, when she served him a meal that didn't meet his standards, he broke her nose. Marcus presented our case methodically. Thomas testified again, unshakable in his account. Medical experts testified about my injuries, confirming they were consistent with being struck by a fist, not with a fall or an accident. Dr. Patel testified about the pattern of injuries I'd sustained over 18 months, each one consistent with assault rather than accidental injury. The prosecution presented the text messages between Matthew and Kayla, their financial records showing $94,000 in debt, and the evidence that Matthew had been pressuring me to sign over my house. A forensic psychologist testified about the pattern of financial abuse targeting vulnerable elders. Diana's testimony brought several jurors to tears. When she described the night Matthew strangled her, 2 women in the jury box wiped their eyes. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Rebecca. My daughter took the stand on the 3rd day of trial, and she didn't hold back. Matthew has always been cruel, she said, her voice clear and strong. Growing up, he bullied me relentlessly. He'd hit me, steal from me, break my things, and then convince our mother it was my fault. I moved to Portland partly to get away from him, but I never imagined he'd turn that same cruelty on Mom. She described years of watching Matthew manipulate me, demand money, and verbally berate me whenever I didn't comply with his wishes. He once told me that Mom was good for nothing except her checkbook. This was 5 years ago, long before Christmas. The assault didn't come out of nowhere. It was the inevitable result of decades of viewing our mother as property. Hutchins's defense strategy was to put me on trial. During cross-examination of every witness, he implied I was confused, manipulative, or outright lying. When I finally took the stand, he went for the throat. Mrs. Wells, isn't it true that you've experienced significant memory problems over the past 2 years? No, I said firmly. That's completely false. But you've had multiple falls and injuries, haven't you? Doesn't that suggest declining physical and mental capacity? Those weren't falls. Those were assaults by my son that I was too ashamed to report. Hutchins produced my medical records, pointing to a note from a doctor's visit where I'd mentioned occasionally forgetting where I put my keys. Doesn't this indicate memory loss, Mrs. Wells? No, I said, meeting his eyes. It indicates I'm a normal 64-year-old woman who sometimes misplaces her keys. It doesn't indicate dementia, and it certainly doesn't justify my son breaking my nose. The defense's case was weak. Matthew took the stand in his own defense, which Marcus later told me was a desperate move. Matthew claimed the punch was an accident, that he gestured wildly during an argument and made unfortunate contact with my face. I love my mother, Matthew said, and I almost believed the tears in his eyes. I would never intentionally hurt her. This whole situation is a nightmare. Yes, I lost my temper. Yes, I said things I regret, but I never meant to injure her. Marcus destroyed him on cross-examination. Mr. Wells, you testified you gestured wildly and accidentally hit your mother. Can you demonstrate this gesture for the jury? Matthew awkwardly swung his arm in a sweeping motion that looked nothing like a punch. Interesting, Marcus said, because Thomas Morrison testified that you hit your mother with a closed fist, like this. Marcus demonstrated a direct punch, and the medical evidence shows a targeted blow to the center of her face, consistent with a punch, not a wild gesture. Were you lying then, or are you lying now? Matthew stammered, contradicted himself, and finally admitted he'd been very angry, but insisted it was still an accident. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict. We find the defendant, Matthew Wells, guilty of assault and battery against an elder causing great bodily injury. We find the defendant guilty of elder abuse under California Penal Code 368B1. Guilty on all counts. Matthew's face crumpled. Kayla screamed from the gallery. Judge Morrison banged her gavel, demanding order. I sat there numb as the verdict sank in. My son, the baby I'd rocked, The child I'd sacrificed everything for was going to prison, and I felt nothing but relief. Sentencing day arrived 6 weeks later. Judge Morrison's courtroom was once again packed, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was a sense of finality, of justice about to be served. Marcus Richardson stood before the judge and outlined the prosecution's sentencing recommendation: the maximum sentence of 6 years in state prison, plus restitution for my medical expenses and mandatory completion of anger management and batterers intervention programs. Your Honor, Marcus said, Matthew Wells represents a clear danger to vulnerable individuals, particularly elderly women. His pattern of abuse spans over a decade, involving at least 2 victims we know of, his ex-wife and his mother. He has shown absolutely no remorse. Even after being convicted, he continues to maintain that he's the victim in this situation. Hutchins argued for leniency, citing Matthew's lack of a serious criminal record and his difficult financial situation. It was almost laughable. Then Judge Morrison asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, but as I stood at the podium facing my son, my hands trembled. Matthew stared at me with dead eyes, his jaw clenched. Matthew, I began, my voice surprisingly steady, I gave you everything. I worked 60-hour weeks for 23 years to give you opportunities I never had. I paid $47,000 for your education. I gave you $15,000 for your first car. I spent $12,000 on your wedding. When you needed help with your mortgage, I gave you $8,000. When Kayla wanted a new kitchen, I gave you another $6,000. Over the years, I've given you approximately $94,000, not as loans, but as gifts, because you were my son and I loved you. Matthew's expression didn't change, but I saw Kayla shift uncomfortably in her seat. And you repaid me by breaking my nose, by planning to manipulate me into signing over my house, by viewing me as nothing more than a bank account with an inconvenient heartbeat. You didn't just hurt me physically, Matthew. You destroyed every happy memory I had of your childhood. You made me question whether I'd failed as a mother, whether I'd somehow created the monster you became. My voice broke, but I pushed forward. The worst part is that you're not sorry. You're not sorry you hurt me. You're only sorry you got caught. Even now, you think you're the victim. Well, I have news for you. You're not. I am. Diana is. And God help anyone else who gets close to you. I looked up at Judge Morrison. Your Honor, I ask that you impose the maximum sentence. My son needs to understand that abusing vulnerable people has serious consequences, and the rest of society needs to be protected from him. Judge Morrison's face was grave as she addressed Matthew directly. Mr. Wells, I've presided over hundreds of criminal cases, but yours stands out for the sheer callousness and premeditation involved. You didn't just assault your mother in a moment of rage. You systematically abused her for years while plotting to steal her life savings. The evidence shows you're a manipulative, violent individual who poses a significant threat to elderly persons in your life. She sentenced him to the maximum, 6 years in state prison with credit for time served. She also ordered him to pay $47,328 in restitution, covering my medical expenses, therapy costs, and the money Thomas had spent defending me against Matthew's frivolous lawsuit. The civil suit against me was dismissed with prejudice, and Matthew was ordered to pay my attorney fees totaling $23,000. Additionally, Matthew would be subject to a permanent restraining order, prohibiting him from coming within 500 yards of me for the rest of my life. Kayla was charged separately with accessory, after the fact, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. She pleaded guilty in exchange for 3 years probation and 500 hours of community service. The judge also ordered her to have no contact with me. As the bailiffs led Matthew away, he turned and looked at me one last time. I hope you're happy, he spat. You destroyed your own son. No, Matthew, I said quietly. You destroyed yourself. 3 months later, I stood in my backyard with Rebecca, Thomas, Diana, and a group of new friends I'd met through an elder abuse survivors support group. We were celebrating my 65th birthday, my first birthday in years, without the weight of Matthew's manipulation hanging over me. My house was mine, my savings were secure, and I'd updated my will to leave everything to Rebecca and to establish a scholarship fund for domestic violence survivors. Diana had become a dear friend. and together we'd started volunteering with an organization that helped elderly abuse victims navigate the legal system. I'd also started dating a kind widower named Frank who I'd met at the support group. Nothing serious yet, but the possibility of happiness felt real for the first time in decades. As we cut the birthday cake, Rebecca raised her glass. To Mom, the strongest woman I know. I smiled, feeling tears prick my eyes. To new beginnings, I said, and to never being silent again. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. And please comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love hearing from all of you around the world. Remember, you deserve respect, dignity, and love at every age. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. Thank you for being here with me today.